Welcome to the Uniting America podcast, presented to you by braverangels. I'm braverangels National Ambassador and your host, JohnWoodJr. This is your doorway into the movement to save the Republic, the movement to realize the dream of Martin Luther King. Join us. This is the movement to build a house united. Hey folks, welcome back to Uniting America. My guest today for this episode is veteran journalist and Fox News host Trace Gallagher, host of Fox at Night. I've been a guest of Trace's on his program several times now and thought it would be nice to return the favor. So we brought him on. Now, this was a fast-paced conversation about the media's role in polarization, how the media left and right helped us to get to this point where Americans are so divided, the tensions that exist between the work of opinion-making and journalism, and how we draw the line between the two. I had been planning this conversation with Trace for a little while, but it's interesting that it happened while Fox was preparing to settle its suit with Dominion Voting Systems over Fox's coverage of the 2020 election voter fraud claims, and particularly, of course, some of its prominent opinion hosts' endorsement of those claims related to Dominion. This is another moment in time where millions of Americans will find their confidence in at least one side of the media universe to suffer another heavy blow. Yet polling shows that Americans in general have little trust in political news media, broadly speaking, whether we're talking about Fox News or CNN. This conversation gives a Fox insider's view of the reasons why. And now, Trace Gallagher. Trace Gallagher, welcome to Uniting America.
John Wood, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you. And of course, you're local. You and I are both Southern California guys. Right. I'm born and bred in Los Angeles, born and raised in L.A. But you are San Diegan?
I was born in San Diego. Okay. Spent the first decade, a little more than a decade of my life in San Diego. Okay. And then in the mid-'70s, my parents bought an old youth hostel, a ski lodge, right, in Mammoth Lakes, California. And I moved up there. I was the youngest of five. Mm-hmm. My older brothers and sisters had all graduated from high school at that time, so I was in middle school, and we moved to Mammoth. Okay. And so Mammoth became kind of my hometown. Went to high school up there, graduated high school, and then went back to I went back to San Diego eventually and went to University of San Diego and played a little football down there. That's right. Division III, John, not big time, but big enough time for me.
You know what you're doing with the pigskin, and I'm guessing you know what you're doing with the pair of skis. Is that correct?
Yeah. I can get around on both. I can't throw the football like I used to. Of course, I never had a great arm, so I shouldn't act like I did. But I had pretty quick feet, and I was quick enough to get the ball out there in a timely manner. So. Yeah, right. So that was my claim to fame at the time.
Well, I did a little amateur boxing when I was very young. I was raised in boxing gyms. Yeah, but more recently, I went and fractured the knuckle on my left hand, getting mad at punching something that I shouldn't have punched, and so I can't quite throw the jab the way I used to. And so, these are the fruits of aging.
Are you still a fan of boxing? Do you still watch it?
I don't keep up with it religiously, but I'm somebody who's still pretty astute at the history of the sport. So I was raised knowing, everything from, John L. Sullivan to Lennox Lewis and whatnot. And so, I was raised on stories of the old fighters. My father's life was changed by Muhammad Ali, and that first Ali-Frazier fight, which really sort of, captured the attention, not just of the country, but of the world, And actually, that's a pretty good segue into our conversation here because there are all sorts of ways in which, as Americans, we share circumstances.
Sure.
We share proximity to each other, live next to people, attend schools together, and so forth. But there's a way in which, if there are not bridges to one another through culture, it's harder for us to understand each other. It's harder for us to have shared points of reference, and therefore harder for us to have relationships. And if we can't have relationships together, how do we have a democracy together? Right. The first Ali-Frazier fight was something that my dad always raised me with a great deal of sort of nostalgia around, because in my father's memory, that brought America together. Right. For, at least for a brief moment, Ali was, the people's champion. He was controversial, took a stand against the Vietnam War and so forth. Right. A lot of folks who were anti-Ali sort of looked at Frazier as being this guy who, was championing sort of authentic American values, so on and so forth. But when they stepped into the squared circle, everybody paused. Everybody had that moment in common. Right. And I think that for a lot of people today, there's the feeling that as Americans, we just don't have much in common anymore. we've drifted apart in the way that we look at the world, but we also don't necessarily have even pastimes and hobbies and habits in common. Sports seems to be politicized. Entertainment seems to be politicized. Everything seems to be politicized. My starting question for you here is, how do you look at the role of news media in either building a bridge towards Americans being able to understand and be in relationship with each other, or being a thing that sort of drives us apart? It's a big question, but I'm wondering what you do with it.
It is. And I just want to go back if I can, because not to dispute your theory of that we are broken and that sports doesn't bring us together, because I think we've seen a couple of instances this year. Yeah. In fact, every year in every sport that brings us together in microcosms, in small doses. And I think when there's talk about sports divides us because some of the leagues, want to implement different policies that the country disagrees with, that they are split on. But I think if you go to a live event, if you go to a live football game at SoFi like I do, I like the Chargers. So I have Charger season tickets and I go. And when you go in there, you've got 70, 80,000 people sitting in one venue, and there doesn't seem to be these disparate feelings. And these are all, even if you're Charger fans and you're Raider fans or whatever, there seems to be this kind of community. Right. And so nobody knows what the guy sitting next to you, what his political affiliation is. And so when your team scores a touchdown or, big play, there's high fives, right? There's high fives all around. This guy would buy you a beer and you'd buy him a Coke or whatever the deal is. It's just kind of, there's this camaraderie that I have noticed in athletics overall. And I think it kind of breaks down these political barriers. And so you wonder, all these people who are high-fiving and hugging and saying, yeah, they're clearly of different political opinions. I mean, there have to be. They aren't all all the Chargers fans aren't conservative. All the Chargers fans aren't liberal.
That's right.
So there has to be some common ground. And if you take out the politics, which for those instances, in those moments, you are taking politics out of the equation, I think you see this coming together. I think you see athletics bring us together. I think when the Buffalo Bills player suffered the heart attack, and there were people praying on the sidelines.
We talked about that on your show. It was an inspiring moment.
We did, and it brought people together. It brought the country together, and I think that there is actually more uniting us than dividing us. But we have these different factions and these different ideas that people want to put forth in an effort, I think, to be divisive. And I think that's kind of where we get off path. As far as what media goes in there, listen, the media clearly, does not help bring the country together. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who would say, oh man, the media is just bringing everybody together. There are different news organizations who cover different things, who have different political persuasions, who like to cover different topics. And sometimes, that's divisive. So I think our job as media people really should be to try and find some type of ground that we can all at least agree on. I mean, it's not everything. I mean, people are clearly going to have different ideas. And I think that's valuable. I think it's instructive. I think it's valuable. And I think it is beneficial for us to have different opinions and to have different viewpoints. And what troubles me the most in recent stories and stuff we've done was the Stanford law students shouting down the federal judge. I think that's kind of where we get off path. And I don't care what your opinion is, if it was liberals shouting down a conservative judge or a conservative shouting down a liberal judge. I think it's wrong, because I think we are not going, and as you have brought up many times, we are not going to accomplish anything. We are going to get nowhere if we don't have robust debate. And I tell everybody, all these young people that I mentor who want to become television news reporters and anchors and so forth, and I mentor a lot of young kids, and I say, listen, the bottom line is that you absolutely need to hear both sides of the story. You can't just hear one side. You can't shut down one side. You have to have robust debate. Your debate, your words have to be reasoned, and you have to be persuasive. That's the thing. That's how you change minds. You don't change minds by putting your fingers in your ears and just right? You don't change minds by shouting somebody else down. You don't do anything by not allowing somebody else to speak. Make sure that your debate is robust, it's reasoned, it's persuasive, and then sit back and listen to theirs, and may the best person win. That's the way that I view it.
You and I see things very similar in that way, but I want to go ahead and personalize things a little bit once again here. Why do you do what you do? What sent you on the path towards being a journalist? And for that matter, how do you define what you do? Because I think that part of what makes people a little bit confused these days is that a lot of folks run around calling themselves journalists. A lot of people sit in front of cameras and sit in front of microphones, and a lot of people talk about the news and the stories. But when it comes down to it, a lot of times people who look like they're sitting in similar chairs are actually doing very different things.
Sure.
So I want to know sort of how did you get to do what it is that you do currently, and how do you exactly define your craft?
Well, when I was back in college, and I think I told you I was playing athletics, I was playing football and stuff. But in the summertime, I was actually a water skier. I was actually a show skier. Probably before your times. I don't think they have very many shows anymore, John.
It's not a show I've ever been to. Okay.
Right. So back in the day, they would have places like SeaWorld and Cypress Gardens and, different venues around the country would have these water ski shows.
Okay.
And you would go out and you would have a team and you would do these pyramids. They'd build these big pyramids on water skis. And there would be the, jumping and slalom skiing and barefoot water skiing. And there were all kinds of different things. And they would turn it into this themed show. And they would put these things on at a SeaWorld theme park or at Cypress Gardens in Florida or at Great Adventure in New Jersey or Magic Mountain just up the road would have these ski shows. Yeah. And so that's what I did during the summer. And it was great fun. And really one of the best times of my life. But there was one summer when I got hurt. And the show director came up to me and he said, well, listen, we've got two opportunities for you. You can either be in the pickup boat, which is the guy who drives around the boat and he picks up the skis that the skiers drop off, right? Okay. Or you can start announcing some of these ski shows. So I took the latter, right? So I started announcing some of these water ski shows. And that was in the early days of cable, right? It was in the early days of cable when USA Network and places like that, they would put on ping pong if they could, because they didn't have anything to air. Sure. So they would put on, chicken races and ping pong, whatever. And they actually started covering some water ski events. I mean, they don't do it anymore because it wasn't all that popular, but they needed people to be able to talk about what was going on, right? Yeah, and so I was one of those people who I got a chance to kind of do some of that stuff. So I was announcing ski shows live during the ski show, telling people what was going on. And then I got a little side hustle work, not very much, but doing some of these cable broadcasts.
Was there a Vin Scully or a Chick Hearns of ski show commentary?
No.
I'm just wondering, who was your blueprint for that?
And see, that's the whole thing is that's why it didn't succeed. That's why they don't do it anymore because it wasn't very popular. But at the time, when CNN would literally, they would run hours of bowling or hours of whatever they could run because they just needed programming and they didn't have the rights to anything or the money to buy the rights to anything. So all they did was they aired the rabbit races. So that was kind of the theme. And so I did that for a little bit, but it clearly wasn't a pathway to my career, but it gave me some insight into, this is kind of interesting. I really enjoy this. And I was studying business at the University of San Diego, and I decided to incorporate some journalism classes, right? Because USD didn't have any journalism or didn't have communications. So I went out and I was trying to get some journalism classes and see if I would enjoy it. And I did. So I put a resume tape together and I got an internship in San Diego at the ABC affiliate. Back in the day. And I put a resume tape together and I sent it out to a few places and drove it out to a few places like Yuma, Arizona. And I walked into Yuma, Arizona to the NBC affiliate and I said, hey, what do you think? And he said, it's okay. But we really could use somebody. Sure. And, so they gave me a whopping $10,000 a year. I'm sorry, $11,000 a year. Oh my, okay. Every year though, John. It was every year they gave me $11,000.
Hey man, just getting a paycheck, especially you're coming out of college and everything, it's that's a big thing.
It was a big thing. It wasn't I was tending bar earlier and I was making a lot more than $11,000 a year tending bar. So it was a big kind of, I thought, $11,000 a year. How am I going to live on that?
Sure.
But everybody was making that much money. And so you're in with these people who are all, they're all like-minded. They all want to be journalists. They all want to be broadcasters, and they're all making no money. And so we would kind of hang out together and critique each other's work. And, we'd find a place where we can get a 50-cent beer, and we'd go and we'd shoot some pool and stuff like that. And it became very fun. And I went from Yuma, Arizona to Boise, Idaho. Boise, by the way, is the proper pronunciation.
I understand this from the natives. Yeah. Right. But the funny thing about that is that I almost feel like I need to say Boise, because if I say Boise, I don't want anybody to think I'm impersonating a native. And
it isn't crazy, you think. And I'm the same way. I'll say when I'm on television, I'll say Boise, Idaho is this, because really it's Boise.
Correct.
But if the whole world thinks, well, he just say Boise?
Right.
Only Boiseans
say Boise.
They say Boise.
Yeah,
everybody else is like, it's Boise, Idaho.
You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
That's right.
If you're not from
it's one of those things. Okay. It's how do you kind of, how do you narrow the divide? And I think the best way is just to say Boise, Idaho, because everybody knows Boise, Idaho. If you say Boise, they're like, oh, he said Boise again. Drives me crazy when he says Boise. What is Boise?
Yeah.
But in Idaho, it's Boise. So when you're on the air in Idaho, it is, welcome to Boise's 5 o'clock news, Idaho at 5, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I was in Boise for a couple, 3 years, and it was a capital city. And so that's where I started kind of getting into politics, right? So we'd cover a lot of politics, very little crime. I mean, news overall, local news around the country, it's pretty heavy on crime.
Sure.
Boise, Idaho didn't have any crime. I mean, they had a very low crime rate. They had a lot of environmental issues. They had a lot of activism. They had a lot of politics. They had a lot of interesting things that really got me thinking a lot about politics and a lot about how laws are structured and how they, lobbyists come in and they try to sway these people. And so I really learned a lot about politics in Boise, Idaho. And then I went from Boise, Idaho, Boise to Las Vegas, where I worked for the NBC affiliate as well. And I was in Vegas that was at the point in your career where you start getting hits, you start getting people saying, hey, come here. So I would be offered, literally every month, you're offered a couple of different jobs in Los Angeles, in this place, right? Because you're starting to kind of make a name for yourself and people are seeing you and, you're sending tapes out and agents are starting to look at you. And I met a girl on a blind date in Las Vegas. Her name is Tracy. Trace and Tracy.
That's okay.
My actual name is Tracy, but I was always Trace. My dad called me Trace, so I don't really know being Tracy, but that's my name. I went on a blind date. I almost didn't go on a blind date. A buddy of mine, who's very well known in broadcasting, he's a sports broadcaster. His name is Colin Cowherd. And so Colin is done very well in Boston. Colin was the sports guy in Vegas, and I was a news guy. And Colin said to me, he walks into our office one day, he says, hey, I'm dating this girl. She's got a friend. What do you think? How about we go out blind date Saturday night? I've got nothing. So we went. But the girl that I was going with cheated, saw me on TV the night before, ruined the whole blind date thing, did not like what she saw, John.
Oh, boy.
And tried to cancel the date.
Oh, what a bummer.
But this is before cell phones were really prevalent. So she didn't have a cell phone, and the girl she was going with didn't have, there was no way to get a hold of her. So she called her mom. She's like, I don't want to go. This is horrible.
She wasn't able to get the cancellation.
Couldn't get the cancellation in. So it was kind of funny because her mom said, just go. It's, you're not going to marry the guy. Just go on the blind date. So we went on the blind date, and as expected, it was not very good. And it was really awkward, and she was younger than me, and I thought, it's not going to work out.
Plus, your names kept getting confused.
Names are confused, and people are like, oh, it's not going to work out. And so the next day, I called Colin, and he's like, well, what'd you think? I said, you're never going to see that girl again, because I just don't think it worked out. And then her friend calls me later that afternoon and says, oh, well, she had the best time. And I'm thinking, was she on the same date? Because were we on the same date?
Sure.
And so we literally ended up moving across country together 3 months later because I got a job in Florida. And so we moved across country together, and we've now been married for 27 years.
Beautiful.
So the thing is, and I worked in Orlando, Florida, and then I got a job at Fox in 1996. I was one of the first people they hired. So I've been with Fox the entire time they've been on the air, almost 27 years.
Right.
So, and in that time, I've been in Chicago for them, San Francisco, Los Angeles to New York, back to Los Angeles to New York. You know how it is. You just keep moving and you keep trying to build your career. And, and here I am. But I think that the whole media concept of what your effort is in the Braver Angels thing really plays a pivotal part because, you come on our show and I know you're trying to, you're trying to make sure that you're portraying both sides of the story and then trying to guide us in the middle ground, which I think is effective. And that's that's what the goal should be, is to try and find some middle ground. But right now it's not succeeding because it is very divisive in media.
Well, yeah, it's elusive. I mean, you talked about the difference between Boise and Boise, right? The ways in which the American people have come to speak and hear in distinctly different political languages is such that it really challenges the craft of communicating across that divide. And so part of what we're trying to do at Braver Angels is essentially both through sort of direct vehicles for fostering discussion, but also just through narrative work, through the sort of commentary that I try to offer, give people a way of entering into political discussion that allows us to be able to sort of sync up on the plane of those values that we perhaps do still share, those things that do surface, whether it's at the football game or, just sort of in the neighborhood when we pass each other at the supermarket and we don't happen to notice that somebody's got on a MAGA cap or a BLM shirt. We're able to connect on those things that are more fundamental. But ultimately, we do need to be able to engage each other on the points of deep disagreement. And there are ways in which I think most of us would argue that the sort of the news media model can complicate that effort, right? So that's part of what I want to engage you on here. So, I imagine that when you and your friends, that sort of early, that cohort of colleagues and associates you had when you were just breaking into journalism, you guys would have had, Walter Cronkite in the rearview mirror, I guess folks like Edward Murrow and so forth. I'd be curious to know if you think that, maybe we over-romanticize that golden age of journalism. I mean, many of us will think back to the day when you just had ABC and NBC and CBS. You had three networks. Everybody was watching the same thing. Right. There's that polling that showed, although I don't know if this was a very scientific poll, but, this idea that Walter Cronkite was the most respected and trusted man in America. Sure. There was the sense that in those days, the media was providing a shared frame of reference that allowed for us to operate in the same reality and sort of track the same storyline, even if you had disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. I've got more to say about that, but I just want to pause there. Is that a true story, or are we sort of looking at the past through rose-colored glasses, in your opinion?
A little bit.
When we think about it that way.
Yeah, a little bit. I think what happens is that perspective changes, right? And so now you have conservative media outlets. I mean, you have places like the Daily Caller and you have the Federalist and you have some conservative outlets where back in the day when you had just Cronkite and Harry Reasoner and, when there were just three, even Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings, there were just three. That's all you had. There wasn't, maybe there was a little bit in the 80s. There was a little bit of Rush Limbaugh on AM radio that was kind of starting to get through. But for the most part, everybody got their news from one side of the spectrum. And it's not to say that, that Rather and Jennings and Brokaw, now we learn that they were all center left. I mean, Jennings and Dan Rather, to this point, he's in his early 90s. Dan Rather is not center left, he's far left. And Tom Brokaw is center left. And Peter Jennings was center left. So they were all coming from the same perspective. But because you didn't have the other side, because there wasn't somebody who was giving you center right perspective, everybody thought, well, this is kind of the way it is. We all kind of fall within this framework. Yeah. And now, because we have social media and we have, conservative outlets, people are getting different sides to the story. And it's kind of polarizing, right? It's pushing the media outlets further and further to their respective corners, to use a boxing term. Yeah. And that's kind of what's happening. And quite frankly, a lot of it's based on money. People like companies like the New York Times, before in 2014, the New York Times was struggling and they didn't know what the business model was going forward. A lot of people weren't signing up for, the .com memberships and those types of things. And the New York Times was struggling and their subscription numbers were going down every single month, every year. And then along comes Donald Trump and the New York Times decided they were going to pick a side, and they picked a side against Donald Trump and their numbers went up. And it was and still is a very successful business model for them. So that's what happens is the media outlets, democracy dies in darkness, and the Washington Post, and, they figured, democracy dies in darkness, but papers that don't have money also die. And so they had to figure out a way to monetize this thing. And they for all intents and purposes, pick sides.
Right.
And that's what happened, and their models were successful, and that's kind of where we are. We are now. No, there's some of these people are like News Nation saying, "Oh, we're going to cover it right from the middle, right down the middle." Well, they're not. They're really not. I mean, because they're seeing who their advertisers are, they're seeing who their subscribers are, who's watching it, and then they're catering to what that demographic is. Yeah. So if News Nation tomorrow started doing, had 1 million viewers and 850,000 of those viewers were liberals, guess what News Nation would be? Sure. Liberal. They would go with the money. That's the concept.
Well, I want to engage you on this point about objectivity. First of all, let me because it's such an elusive thing, it's easy to hold that up as a value, hold it up as a goal. In practice, it's a difficult thing. First of all, I want to just say that I think you make a really valuable point on the history here, because, many of us will look back and say, they used to play it right down the middle. Walter Cronkite was trusted by all, so on and so forth. And I think that you're right. There's a way in which many conservatives never quite saw it that way. I mean, Barry Goldwater was somebody who was very critical of basically the media establishment in his time. That's partially why you got a National Review and William F. Buckley, right? You sort of needed that counterbalancing voice. And then in the rise of, talk radio, Rush Limbaugh came along later and so forth. And eventually, you might say sort of culminating perhaps in Fox News. Right. Suddenly you have real conservative representation in the conversation. Right. But one of the things that Matt Taibbi told me in a conversation, interview we had with him a while back, is that, you also just had this sort of shift in the business model wherein once upon a time when you had just a few outlets, it was more profitable to try and speak to as many Americans as possible. And so they spoke a language that perhaps wasn't, at least deliberately, polarizing the same way. Whereas then the incentives shift, and just along the lines of what you're saying, in order to sort of capture a share of the market, you had to sort of drive a hard line. So I want to pull those currents into a question about sort of core journalistic ethics and what does it mean to even be a journalist in the first place. The romantic vision we have of it is that journalists ought to strive to be objective. Right. And then, you've got opinion makers, and that, sometimes one masquerades as the other, but that those really should be different things. Sure. I heard Don Lemon say not too long ago, he was sort of giving his definition of himself as a journalist. And I'm not going to quote him exactly here, but I think I'm being fair when I say that he said something very close to, I'm a journalist, and as a journalist, I have an obligation to speak from my own lived experience, or to allow my own lived experience to inform how I cover the issues. Right. And I thought that was really fascinating, because I thought to myself, that almost sounds like the exact opposite of what some people might traditionally have considered a journalist to be. Traditionally speaking, you might have thought that a journalist was somebody who said, okay, I'm going to look at the facts, plain and simple. I'm going to give it to you straight, let you draw your own opinions. And yet, one thing we know about human beings is that we all have our biases, right? We all come from a particular individual experience. Try as you might, I think, it's hard to be 100% neutral. It might be impossible. And so I feel like I see some journalists who are saying, you know what, let's dispense with this idea that we can even be neutral, because we can't. And so let's focus in on just owning the lived experience. It's kind of the Don Lemon approach. And then I think I see other folks who are, trying to sort of hold to that traditional view of let's call balls and strikes. But is there a balance in the middle? I mean, how should a journalist really approach their craft, given the difficulty of objectivity?
Well, one, on Don Lemon, I think Don Lemon kind of gave up his journalist credos a while back when he decided to do an opinion show on CNN, which he did for years, late night opinion show. It was strictly opinion. So, I mean, he can say he's a journalist. I think he's a very talented guy, you know, and I always have.
But this is part of the confusion, the blurring of the lines here.
But he's blurring his own lines because he's no longer a journalist. He decided to become an opinion person, and that's kind of what he does. That's his deal. And listen, good for him. He picked a thing. It's no different than a reporter or a correspondent for the New York Times becoming a columnist, right? They become a columnist and they decide that they get to kind of inflict their opinion in their pieces. That's the way it works. That's the elevation. Don Lemon took that path. Good for him. So, but to say, oh, I can back up and become a journalist again, I think is a little disingenuous. And I think that's what's happening in journalism overall, is that you have some people who are, you know, they are trying at least to bring both sides of the story. My whole idea in journalism is that you really should be allowing people to make up their own minds. You should be giving them enough information from both sides. And sometimes it's skewed because stories are skewed. I mean, they come from different perspectives. They come from different parts of the country, from different parts of the world. Sometimes stories themselves are just inherently different, and they come from a different part of the political spectrum. That's just the way it is. But as a journalist, your goal should be is to take the information that you have, the factual information that you have, and you give it to the audience, and you kind of let the audience draw their own conclusion. You shouldn't have to steer them down the road. It's like I always say, I should never know what my teacher's political affiliation is. I just shouldn't. I mean, my daughters are at the University of Alabama, but when they were in high school, you know, there was clearly some political influence in some of these classes. And my question was always, why is it that students should have to know what political persuasion their teachers are? You should never know that. You should be teaching information. You're not teaching ideology. You're giving students information, and you should give it to them in the best, most compelling way you can, but you should not be trying to skew the information you give. I should never know the political affiliation of my judge. If I stand before a judge because I committed a crime, if I did wrong, I should never know the political affiliation of my judge, and we're losing that in America now. Even circuit court judges and local judges, we are losing that because we know their political affiliation. So do the lawyers. The lawyers are bringing lawsuits to certain courts because they know those will be more successful to them. I mean, this Donald Trump lawsuit was clearly brought to the court in Manhattan because they know, Alvin Bragg knows the people of Manhattan do not like Donald Trump. I mean, 98% voted against him. So he knows he's got a really good opportunity and good odds of getting a jury that is not going to be persuaded or, you know, influenced by Donald Trump. They're not going to be on his team.
Now, let me jump in and try and pin you down really quick on that statement, Trace. Is that a statement coming from a place of opinion or responsible journalistic observation? Because what you said to me makes sense. And I'm in a position where, you know, I'm an opinion columnist. I try and speak to left and right, try and bring people together. But I'm in this weird murky ground as a podcaster where I can be sort of upfront about my own sorts of, you know, biases and instincts and say that I think what you said makes perfect sense. But is it easy and comfortable to say a thing like that, given the fact that you're speaking to a person's motivation? Because I'm sure I'm guessing he wouldn't say that about himself.
Alvin Bragg?
Alvin Bragg.
Yeah, maybe he wouldn't say that about himself, but I think if
he would present himself as somebody who's dispassionately pursuing justice.
Yes, but he's also presented himself as a progressive. He is also a self-described progressive. So he clearly comes from one side of the political spectrum. So he campaigned because he knew he wanted this position. He campaigned on making Donald Trump pay. He campaigned on, you know, justice, providing justice for the people of his district, and that Donald Trump was a part of that. And his take is, and whether he's right, wrong, or you know, doesn't matter. His campaign was that he was going to make Donald Trump pay for the crimes or the wrongs that he did, and so he did that, and he's living up to that. Understood. I don't think anybody is going to say, oh, Alvin Bragg is a right down the middle, fair, you know, a jurist. He is not coming at this from center ground. He's admitted to that. He is a progressive district attorney. And that's kind of where he sits. And progressive is far left. He came through a far left ideology. And I don't think he's trying to hide that. I don't think there's any question he's trying to hide that. What I think he's saying is that he is following the letter of the law when it comes to Donald Trump. But I don't think there's any question that while he says he's following the letter of the law, he is coming at it from an entirely different perspective. He's coming at it from the left instead of coming at it from the middle. So there's clear bias going into it. Whether or not Donald Trump was wrong or was felonious in this thing is a separate matter. And it should be adjudicated by a jury of his peers and down the line. How Alvin Bragg comes at this case is pretty clear where his political affiliation lies and where his loyalty lies is, I think, very evident to everybody. Even those who are on the left would acknowledge, yeah, Alvin Bragg he's a far left prosecutor. George Gascon is a far left prosecutor. Yeah, George Gascon is never going to speak at a CPAC hearing where he's just not going to feign conservatism. Just to get votes. It's just not where he comes from.
Well, I just wanted to sneak a jab in on you on that point, Trace, just because you're speaking to this larger issue of, I mean, earlier, even before we jumped on the mic, I think we started to talk about just the politicization of everything. And, even sports. And of course, sports is a bit more resistant to that than some other things. But you would like to think that media, that the law, that our institutions would be able to maintain their credibility by presenting themselves as being more concerned with the welfare of the American people and executing their particular functions in our society, regardless of any sort of political biases by anybody who might be in them. But we are rapidly losing our confidence that's true. I do think that the Bragg example is a good one and an appropriate one because, again, whether you agree or disagree, the scent of politics on justice is one that's tough. The scent of politics on the integrity of information as it comes through the media is something that's really that's really tough. It undermines our confidence in our institutions and in each other. Right. So I want to ask you: is it a problem that in the journalism industry in general, that although I think in good faith we might like to believe that a majority of people are seeking the truth and seeking to be honest and so forth, that nevertheless, I think the stat I've heard is that some 93% of journalists are people who lean left, vote left. I don't know if they're registered Democrats typically, but even if they don't wear their politics on their shirt. Is that a problem right off that the industry tends to pull so heavily from people whose backgrounds are on one side of the political aisle or the other? Or should that not make a difference so long as people are studying what it means to be a journalist and trying to check their politics at the door? Right. No, I think kind of back to my earlier statement where I shouldn't know the politics of the journalist that I'm listening to. Right. And I shouldn't know the politics of my teacher. And I shouldn't know the politics of my judge. Do those people deserve and have the right to share their own ideology and to believe how they want? Absolutely. They can believe any way they want. They can be on any side of the aisle they want. But when they're dealing with somebody else, when they're providing information, when they are providing a verdict, when they are providing education, they should do it in a way that leaves politics out. So you should not be punished, right? You said if John Wood goes into a courtroom for a traffic ticket, you should not have to pay an extra $100 because the judge deems that you are leaning to one side of the political aisle or the other. That's not the way justice works, right? It's supposed to be blind, and justice is no longer blind. And we're learning this. And that's the saddest part about it. Education is supposed to be unbiased. It is supposed to be teaching information so that students can use this information and make their own decisions, to be able to read and to write and to do mathematics so they can take this information and they can live better lives and they can have make their own decisions and move on. And that's the concept. Journalists, are they far left? Yeah. Most polls say that journalists are lean to the left. And I think that doesn't bother me one bit. It's what they do in the arena of journalism that is most important.
I mean, you can be any political persuasion. You can do anything you want to. I don't care. I have no care. I do care that you bring your politics to work with you, and now you, instead of being a journalist, you're an activist. And I have problems with that.
But even short of that, is there a reason to be concerned about the echo chamber effect? That even if you're coming to your job with good intentions, with wanting to sort of honor the requirements of your position, when you're just surrounded by people who maybe see the world in a somewhat similar way as you do, but you have to then speak to a whole country full of people who don't, does it not make it more likely that you might frame issues in a way that tilts a certain way? I mean, there's this term that's usually applied to sort of interethnic sort of privilege versus non-privileged sort of interactions called implicit bias, right? So the implicit bias that you might have if you're a person of privilege, so on and so forth. But is there not something like that unfolds in institutions, whether they're concentrated to the left or to the right, but in the case of media, it tends to be concentrated towards the left? Right. Is there a way in which it's just hard to see conservative America if you're just surrounded by folks from the left, even if you're trying your damnedest?
Sure. I mean, very, very much so. I mean, people in, and I think I said this earlier, my girls go to the University of Alabama, right? Yeah. And Alabama is a conservative state. Yeah. And the University of Alabama is not a conservative university. I mean, it's kind of like universities around the country where it tends to be, it actually tends to lean liberal because that's the university model, right? So, but at the same time, the people who live in Alabama have a hard time understanding how the people of California rationalize things, right? They don't quite see, they don't quite understand how they're actually reasoning and rationalizing different topics. And it's the same way that people in California don't really quite see how the people of Alabama and some people in the South are rationalizing the things that they believe are important to them. There has been this kind of attack on Christianity as of late. I mean, it's not as of late. It's been long standing. I mean, it just seems to me like nowadays that Christians are more open game than ever, is that nobody has to apologize for attacking Christians. Nobody has to apologize. We just had a case of a person who went and attacked a church, a Catholic church, and it was a slap on the wrist and out you go. And that's the way it is. Now, had somebody went in and attacked a different religion, one would believe that the consequences would be more severe because we have seen that as kind of a pattern, right? But when you attack Christianity, we just learned this in the shooting a couple of weeks ago in where the trans person walked in and shot a Christian school, shot 3 9-year-olds and 3 adults. And it wasn't long before the media started saying, they weren't looking for, oh my gosh, the kids and the adults and the Christian school was attacked. It was being turned to now trans people are under fire. Trans people have a target on their backs. And you think, well, how did we get to there? How did that narrative shift? And that's what's happening, is that the first side to be able to shift the narrative most effectively tends to win these types of arguments. By the way, on that point, how much is social media now sort of complicating the craft of journalism? And there's a whole bunch of ways in which we could possibly come at that. Part of what occurs to me in that particular example is that you had this tragic shooting, and then I think you did have people sort of saying like, well, there's this larger issue of sort of attacks on the trans community, and we need to be concerned, with that, even while we're sort of still mourning, the loss of these folks at this Christian school. Doesn't seem to get a lot of sympathy in comparison to other events. But one thing I also noticed was that when I was on Twitter, I'm on social media and so forth, I'm seeing a lot of people saying things like, well, look, this is what you get, sort of with some of these crazy trans people and so forth, this is an ideology that is capable of turning violent and so forth. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, on the one hand, I want to just empathize with the victims, right? I want to live in a world where when we have loss of life, we take the time to honor that and not make it about, tribal narratives in one direction or the other. Right. At the same time, I imagine, I can imagine some of my liberal journalist friends and commentator friends looking at some folks on the right kind of, referring to this as a trans issue on social media.
Does that bubble up to some of the news coverage? I mean, it's a big jumbled mess in my mind, but I feel like social media is a part of what's scrambling things, because I feel like it's hard for us to have a clear sense of where reality is, because social media sort of gives us this cultivated outrage sampling, outrage-based sampling of reality. I'm just wondering how that factors in to the way in which mainstream media or traditional media sort of covers things.
Yeah, I mean, and here's an example of how strong social media has become, and the different factions of social media. Yeah. And they really have. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take a very large group on social media to make a very large impact.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what we're learning, is that if you look at the transgender issue, and we are at a situation where we've done poll after poll after poll, and the whole concept of should transgender athletes should biological males be able to compete against biological females in high school, junior high school, and college? Yeah. And 85% of America says no, because it's not fair. 85%. And yet it is a hot and passionate debate in this country. You have 15% of the population, according to these polls, that believes that biological men should be able to compete against biological women. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of the same thing as 85% of the population thinks the sky is blue, right? Mm-hmm. And the 15% who don't. We don't have this debate on whether the sky is blue, because even if 15% believe that it's not blue, it's not big enough. It's not enough of a groundswell to change the conversation, because 85% they're just not going to listen to 15% of the population. We're a democracy. And yet the 15% of the population in this case, where they're fighting to have biological males compete against females, has become so strong on social media. And it seems like this force to be reckoned with, when the reality is that the vast majority of America believes you're not right. Yeah. And yet we're having this argument every day, because that's how powerful social media has gotten. We think they're this dominant force, when the reality is they're not. They're just very vocal. They're very loud. They've got the megaphone and they're very loud. And because they're very loud, America thinks that it's an even debate. And it's not. Yeah.
And even zooming out of this particular example and just speaking to things in general, it's always possible that the 15% can be right about an issue.
It's always possible, sure.
But certainly it's the case
that's not
that
democracy. That's not the place we live in.
Well,
that's not the place we live.
Right. But again, to your point, if that 15% or if a minority of people are concentrated in a place where they happen to have their hands on the megaphone, then suddenly, it changes the impression of things fairly dramatically. I mean, and it gets back to the politicization of everything too. We can't even rely, I guess, on our beer companies to not, polarize us a little bit. If anything should be bringing us together as beer, I suppose.
And Bud Light apologized today for this, because they know it's been costing them a lot of money, $5 billion. So Bud Light came out and apologized to this today.
And so it's an interesting thing, because, you have people who are, within the institution, in this case, the institution of Anheuser-Busch, who I think, maybe have a certain frame of reference, want to sort of, send a certain social signal, and that's important to them. But they may not even realize themselves whether they are right or wrong, just how much they find themselves out of touch with where most people are at. And in this case, their consumer base. But this comes to my mind to be another example, and I think that there's a multitude of examples we could point to in terms of how it is that our institutions and our predominant sort of organizations in American life, civic and political, but not just that, corporations and so forth, have found themselves just sort of out of touch with the people that they serve. And it shows up a lot in just sort of the media storytelling. I think that you've got a lot of ways in which, media is sort of covering things. I think media sort of, most outlets would seem to lean left, but conservative media reaches a lot of people. I think most Americans feel like they're left out in the middle, somewhere.
Right.
Most Americans would say, you got a lot of Democrats who watch Fox News. You still got, a number of Republicans who watch, CNN and certainly ABC, NBC. But I don't feel like most Americans feel like they're really being spoken to. I feel like they're being spoken at.
Sure.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if you can sympathize with that.
Well, I can. And I think, it just goes back to some of these things where when you had the Georgia voting law came in and everybody from President Biden to Coca-Cola to Delta Airlines to Major League Baseball called it, Jim Crow 2.0. They said it was racist. And they said, they pulled the All-Star game. They pulled the All-Star game out of Atlanta. It cost Atlanta a city with a large black population. It cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And so they pulled it out of Atlanta. And it turns out at the end, when the vote was counted in Georgia, that they polled people and 98% of black voters said, no, we had no problem voting. It was exactly the same. In fact, it was in many cases easier, 98%. You can't get 98% again to go out and say this guy is blue. You just can't. And so, but none of these companies apologized. Coca-Cola didn't apologize. Delta Airlines didn't apologize. Nobody apologized for doing that to the state of Georgia, right? It was unjust. It was wrong. They were wrong about their stance, and yet nobody apologized. They just moved on to the next cause. And they will continue to do that, to pick a cause. They're not going to pick a cause that supports Donald Trump because they know that even though maybe 45% of the population support Donald Trump, they're not about to jump on that because they think it's the wrong side of history. So corporations think that's the wrong side of history. Corporations jumping on board with Christian organizations, they think it's the wrong side of history. And so they're just not going to do it. And so that's kind of where we feel. They feel safer in speaking out about liberal causes because they think that it's okay. It's the same thing about, you walk in. After Donald Trump won the election back in 2016, I was flying home the next morning because I was in New York and I was flying back to LA and people are walking on and they're yelling. They're angry about the Donald Trump thing. They're angry that he won and they're throwing stuff and they're like, this is BS. And you think it would never, if somebody was angry that Hillary Clinton had won and a conservative walked in and said, this is BS, it wouldn't be accepted. But you can get angry about Donald Trump and it's accepted. You can get angry about something that the conservatives are doing that makes you mad and it's accepted. But if you get angry at something the liberals are doing, sometimes you don't voice it, which is the problem we've had in all this polling, is that they have found that the reason they underpolled Trump in 2016 and again in the conservatives in 2018 is because people are reticent to give their opinions because they think that I don't want to say that it's Joe Biden with the MAGA conservatives. It's the MAGA conservatives. It's the MAGA radicals. It's the people who feel like they're being villainized just because they supported a different political position than somebody else.
Final fundamental question, and and maybe this goes right to the heart of attention. Feel free to push back on the framing, but I seem to recall, I can't remember the exact figure, but during the height of the Black Lives Matter protest, some significant percentage of Americans believed that African Americans were being gunned down in the streets by the tens of thousands. Had a grossly inflated sense of how many people were actually dying at the hands of police. Whatever you think about that issue, Americans were dramatically out of touch with what the facts were. Right. But I can go back a few years before that and remember when polling suggested that some 55% or so of Fox viewers believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq, right? To run up to the Iraq war and so forth. And of course, that was not true.
Not true.
Many people feel that it's going to be hard to bring the American people together, if we don't rally around truth. Now, I feel like there's a way in which, just bludgeoning each other with facts isn't going to get us anywhere if we don't have some basic human respect.
Sure.
But as a journalist, do you have some sense that both sides of the aisle could do better, particularly when you involve opinion commentary, in allowing us to reside in the realm of, as close as we can, to being in touch with sort of empirical reality? Is there any way we can do that while also being drunk on partisan narrative? And with that, I'm going to give you the final word.
I think that just to go back to your point where you have, journalism and media and the whole concept that it can be fair and it can be balanced and it can try and give you both sides of the story. I mean, you have to kind of think back to the whole Russian collusion thing, which was wrong. It was as wrong as the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So Russian collusion turned out to be every bit as wrong as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which for all intents and purposes, caused us to fight 2 separate wars, right? But the idea is that the Washington Post and the New York Times shared a Pulitzer, ostensibly the highest prize in journalism, one of the highest prizes in journalism, for their coverage of Russian collusion. And yet it never happened. You have this special counsel report that came out and said, in essence, there's nothing there. There was no evidence that any of this ever happened. So the New York Times, the Washington Post didn't give back their Pulitzer. They didn't give back like, well, you know what? That was really not a story that we covered for 2.5 years that we won a Pulitzer Prize for. I mean, you imagine winning Best Picture for a movie that was never made? It's just the whole concept of if you really want honesty in journalism, and it's the same across every different platform, whether it's newspapers or broadcast or whatever, people make mistakes. And when you make a mistake, whether it's about weapons of mass destruction or climate change or Russian collusion, you should correct it. It should be corrected, and it should be stated that, you know what, we got that wrong. We got it wrong. We have covered, John, school shootings for decades, right? And it's a sad thing. And every time we cover them, and I say the same thing, and I've covered a lot, I say the information that we're telling you now is being given to us by police officers, and it invariably will change. It's going to change because it's the fog of war. The early minutes of these things, we just don't know the precise details. We're giving you the best of our ability, but with a caveat that it may change. In fact, it will likely change. That's kind of where you have to deal with journalism, is that we need to make sure that we are reporting the truth before we report it. And we tend to get ahead of ourselves because, first sometimes translates into dollars, right? The first, the one who's the loudest tends to translate into dollars, clicks, dollars, advertising rates. So I think, for the benefit of the whole country, I think, there should be more of an emphasis. You can have political ideology, but you need to have truth. It needs to be true. And that's the key to the whole thing. You can still cover what you want. And it's like I say to everybody else, I say, you look at people, the whole country applauds people who want to be transgender. Nobody cares. Nobody cares if you're gay. Nobody cares anymore about any of that stuff. That's just the way it is. Now, they do care that a biological male wants to shower with high school girls. That's a concern. That's a concern about parents. They don't care this person is transgender. They care this transgender person now wants the right to go in and shower with this biological male wants to shower, or this biological male wants to compete against females. They care about that. They care about the fairness of it, but they don't care they do care that, that parents are being kept out of the loop when their child wants to transition. They care about that because they don't think it's fair. Why would a school district that has to get parental consent to give a child an aspirin be able to conceal the fact that child is now on puberty blockers? And that's something that parents don't deserve to know because the parents don't always have the right goals in mind or, the best intents for their children.
Understood.
That is a problem. So you see where America stands. America, for the most part, they don't care what people do. They don't care as long as those people don't suddenly make them, bow at their altar. That's the problem in America. Americans don't care what people do for the most part, as long as those people don't make the rest of America bow at their altar. That's the problem we have in America right now.
And if we can get past that, we can remember that we still got enough in common to get along.
We do.
Yeah. Trace Gallagher, thank you for joining me on Uniting America.
John Wood, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Uniting America. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating, review, or suggestions. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tune in for more content. And learn more about the movement to depolarize America at braverangels.org.